I found out my HOA sold my reserved parking spaces while I was loading groceries into my Honda Accord, and some guy in a BMW started screaming at me to move my car. The morning started normal enough in my Phoenix condo complex, but by noon, I was standing in the Arizona heat arguing with a stranger who claimed he owned the 2 spots I'd been paying for since 2019. My name is William Ingram, and I'd lived at Desert Vista Condominiums for 7 years. When I bought my unit, the developer included 2 reserved parking spaces directly in front of my ground floor condo. The spots had my unit number painted on them, 147, and my HOA fees included the maintenance of those spaces. I never thought twice about it until that Tuesday in March when everything fell apart. The guy in the BMW was red-faced and pointing at some laminated card. "I paid $15,000 for these spots. You need to move your vehicle immediately or I'm calling a tow truck." I stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "What are you talking about? These are my spots. They came with my condo." "Not anymore," he said, waving the card in my face. "The HOA sold them to me last month. I have documentation." My stomach dropped. I pulled out my phone and called the HOA management office. A woman named Brenda answered, sounding bored. "Desert Vista HOA, how can I help you?" "This is William Ingram in Unit 147. Someone just told me my parking spaces were sold. What's going on?" There was typing on the other end. "Oh yes, Mr. Ingram. The board voted to sell all previously included parking spaces to raise funds for the new clubhouse renovation. You should have received a notice." "I didn't receive anything, and you can't just sell my parking spaces. They're part of my property." "Actually, Mr. Ingram, if you review your HOA governing documents, parking spaces are considered limited common elements that can be reassigned by the board. The vote was unanimous. You can purchase new spaces if any become available, but currently there's a waiting list." I felt my blood pressure spike. "So where am I supposed to park?" "Street parking is available, or you can use the guest lot on a first-come basis. Have a nice day." She hung up. The BMW guy was still standing there with his arms crossed. "So? Are you moving or not?" I looked at my groceries melting in the Arizona sun, then at this smug stranger who'd bought my parking spots. "Give me 5 minutes." I moved my car to the street 3 blocks away because everything closer was full. By the time I hauled my groceries back to my condo, I was drenched in sweat and furious. I immediately started digging through my documents, looking for the HOA bylaws in my purchase agreement. Sure enough, buried in the HOA CC and Rs was language about limited common elements, but my purchase agreement explicitly stated that 2 parking spaces were included with the unit. I took photos of everything and sent an email to the HOA board demanding an explanation. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange tow truck parked near the entrance of the complex. The driver, a guy in his mid-30s with a shaved head and grease-stained coveralls, was drinking coffee and watching the parking lot. His truck had "Mike's Towing" painted on the side. I went out to move my car for work and found a ticket on my windshield. Not a towing notice, but an HOA violation citation. "Vehicle parked on street overnight. First offense warning. Subsequent violations will result in towing and fines." I stood there reading it 3 times, certain I was losing my mind. They sold my parking spaces and now they were citing me for parking on the street. The tow truck driver walked over. "Rough morning?" "You have no idea," I said, crumpling the citation. "The HOA here is insane." He grinned. "Oh, I know. I'm Walker Jameson. The HOA hired me to patrol this complex and tow violations. I've been watching this place for a week, and let me tell you, what they're doing is sketchy as hell." I looked at him with surprise. "You're the HOA's tow truck driver?" "Yep, and between you and me, I think they're running some kind of scam. I've towed 8 cars this week for bogus violations. Half of them were residents who apparently didn't know about new parking rules." That caught my attention. "What new rules?" "They sent out an email last week saying all street parking is prohibited from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. But I heard from other residents they never got the email. The HOA claims they sent it, but I think they're lying so they can rack up towing fees. I get paid per tow, but this doesn't sit right with me." I explained what happened with my parking spaces. Walker listened, shaking his head. "That's messed up. Look, I have to do my job, but I'll give you a heads up when I can. Don't park on the street overnight, or I'll have to tow you. The HOA checks my logs. Where am I supposed to park? Guest lot, I guess. Get there early. We exchanged phone numbers, and I headed to work at the engineering firm where I'd been employed for 9 years. All day I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about the parking situation and checking my email for a response from the HOA board. Finally, at 4 p.m., I got a reply from someone named Patricia Kensington, the HOA board president. The email was curt and condescending. Mr. Ingram, the board's decision to monetize limited common elements was made in accordance with our governing documents and Arizona state law. Your purchase agreement does not supersede the HOA's authority to manage common areas. If you have concerns, you may attend the next board meeting on April 2nd. Regards, Patricia Kensington, board president. I immediately drafted a response pointing out that my purchase agreement was a legal contract and that selling my spaces without compensation was likely illegal. I cited Arizona property law and demanded they either return my spaces or compensate me for their value. Her response came an hour later. Mr. Ingram, if you continue to harass the board with frivolous legal threats, we will be forced to fine you for violations of community conduct standards. This matter is closed. That night, I parked in the guest lot at 5 p.m. to ensure I had a spot. By 8 p.m., the lot was completely full, with residents circling like vultures. I watched from my window as arguments broke out over spaces. One woman was crying because she had a baby and groceries and nowhere to park. I called Walker. This is insane. There aren't enough guest spots for everyone who lost their reserved parking. I know, he said. I've been getting calls all night from the HOA, demanding I tow cars from the guest lot for excessive use. Apparently, residents aren't allowed to use guest parking for more than 4 hours at a time. But nobody told them that. This has to be illegal. Probably. But HOAs in Arizona have a lot of power. You'd need a lawyer. I spent that night researching HOA law and found a lawyer in Scottsdale who specialized in homeowner disputes. Her name was Rebecca Torres, and her website was full of horror stories about abusive HOAs. I sent her a detailed email explaining my situation and attached all my documentation. She called me the next morning. Mr. Ingram, I read your email. What your HOA did is legally questionable, but HOAs operate under business judgment protection. They can make decisions that seem unfair as long as they follow their procedures. The question is whether they properly notice the vote and whether your purchase agreement creates a contractual right they can't override. So what are my options? I can send them a demand letter, but that'll probably escalate things. HOAs hate lawyers. They'll likely retaliate with fines and violations. The other option is to rally other residents and force a recall of the board, or sue for breach of contract and seek damages. But litigation is expensive and slow. How expensive? $5,000 to $10,000 to start, potentially more if it goes to trial. I thanked her and said I'd think about it. I couldn't afford that kind of legal bill, not with my student loans and mortgage, but I couldn't just accept losing my parking spaces either. That afternoon, I created a Facebook group called Desert Vista HOA Victims and invited every resident I could find online. Within hours, 50 people had joined. The stories were horrifying. The HOA had apparently sold over 30 reserved parking spaces for $15,000 each, raising nearly $500,000. But the clubhouse renovation they claimed to be funding had never started. Nobody knew where the money went. One resident, a retired teacher named Margaret, posted copies of financial documents she'd requested under Arizona's HOA disclosure laws. The documents showed that Patricia Kensington and 2 other board members had given themselves management bonuses totaling $200,000. Another resident pointed out that the same 3 board members owned a company called Desert Property Solutions, which had been awarded a $100,000 contract to consult on the clubhouse renovation. No work had been done. I felt sick reading it. This wasn't just bad governance, it was fraud. I called Walker again. You need to see this. He came over that evening, and I showed him the Facebook group. He scrolled through the posts, his expression darkening. This is way worse than I thought. You need to report this. To who? The HOA is supposed to regulate itself? No, I mean the Arizona Attorney General's office. They have a division that investigates HOA fraud, and maybe the police. I hadn't considered that. I took screenshots of everything and drafted a complaint to the Attorney General's office. Walker helped me organize the evidence, pulling up Arizona statutes on embezzlement and fraud. We worked until midnight, building a case. The next day, I submitted the complaint online. The website said someone would review it within 30 business days. In the meantime, the parking situation was getting worse. The HOA started towing cars from the guest lot after 4 hours, stranding residents. Walker called me before each tow, giving people warnings, but his boss at the towing company was pressuring him to stop. "They're threatening to fire me if I don't follow the HOA's instructions exactly," Walker told me. "I might lose this contract." "I'm sorry. You've been helping so much. It's not your fault. This HOA is corrupt. I've worked with a lot of them, and I've never seen anything like this." By the end of March, I'd received 3 more violation citations for various infractions. One was for having a wreath on my door, which apparently violated the uniform aesthetic standards. Another was for my trash can being visible from the street for 10 minutes after collection. The third was for excessive noise, because I was on a phone call on my patio at 7 p.m. Each citation came with a $100 fine. I didn't pay any of them, and the HOA sent me a letter saying I was now in arrears and facing a lien on my property. Rebecca Torres, the lawyer, called me. "Mr. Ingram, I've been following your Facebook group. Several other residents have contacted me. I think we have enough people to file a class action lawsuit against the HOA for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Are you interested?" "How much would that cost?" "I'd take it on contingency. If we win, I take a percentage of the settlement or judgment. If we lose, you don't pay." "What's the catch?" "It'll take a long time, months, maybe years, and the HOA will fight dirty. You'll be target number 1. I thought about it for about 5 seconds. "Let's do it." Rebecca started preparing the lawsuit. In the meantime, the Facebook group grew to over 100 members. We organized a protest at the next board meeting on April 2nd. 50 residents showed up, filling the small clubhouse meeting room to capacity. Patricia Kensington was exactly what I expected. Mid-50s, blonde helmet hair, designer pantsuit, and an expression like she smelled something bad. She sat at the head table with 2 other board members, a man named Gerald, who looked half asleep, and a woman named Susan, who kept checking her phone. Patricia banged a gavel. "This meeting will come to order. We have a full agenda, so please hold your comments until public forum." "We want to talk about the parking spaces," someone shouted. "Public forum is at the end of the agenda," Patricia said coldly. "You will wait your turn." The meeting dragged on for an hour as they discussed landscaping contracts and pool schedules. People were getting restless. Finally, Patricia opened the public forum. "You each get 2 minutes. Keep it civil." I went first. "My name is William Ingram, Unit 147. The board sold my reserved parking spaces without notice or compensation. I want to know where the money from those sales went and why the clubhouse renovation hasn't started." Patricia barely looked at me. "Your concerns are noted. Next." One by one, residents stood up and told similar stories. Patricia dismissed each of them with the same phrase. "Your concerns are noted. Next." When Margaret stood up and asked about the $200,000 in management bonuses, Patricia's face went red. "Those bonuses were approved by the board and are none of your business." "We're homeowners. It's absolutely our business," Margaret shot back. "This meeting is adjourned," Patricia said, slamming the gavel down. "You can't just adjourn because you don't like the questions," I said, standing up. "I can do whatever I want. I'm the board president. If you don't like it, run for the board yourself." "Maybe I will," Patricia sneered. "Good luck with that. Elections aren't until next year." The crowd erupted in angry shouts. Patricia and the other board members hurried out a side door, leaving us standing there furious and helpless. Walker was waiting outside by his tow truck. "How'd it go?" "About as well as you'd expect." I was listening by the door. He glanced around and lowered his voice. "I found something you need to see." We walked to his truck, and he pulled out a folder. "I do towing for a lot of HOAs, so I know the managers. I asked around about Patricia Kensington. Turns out she's done this before. She was board president at another complex in Tempe 3 years ago. They caught her embezzling, and she resigned before they could press charges. She just moved here and got herself elected." I stared at the documents he showed me. Newspaper articles, complaint filings, everything. This is huge. Can I copy this? Take it. I made copies. I immediately sent everything to Rebecca Torres in the Attorney General's office. Rebecca called me within an hour. This changes everything. If she's a repeat offender, we can establish a pattern of fraud. I'm escalating our lawsuit. Things moved quickly after that. Rebecca filed the class action lawsuit on April 15th, naming Patricia Kensington, the other board members, and Desert Property Solutions. The lawsuit alleged fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, and conversion of property. It demanded the return of all parking spaces to their original owners, full financial restitution, and punitive damages. The HOA went ballistic. I received a cease and desist letter claiming I was defaming the board. Rebecca laughed when I showed it to her. That's not how defamation works. Truth is an absolute defense. Ignore it. The HOA didn't stop there. They started fining me for everything. My grass was a quarter-inch too long. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My car was parked 1 inch over the guest lot line. Within 2 weeks, I had over $5,000 in fines. Rebecca filed an emergency motion to stop the retaliatory fines. The judge granted a temporary restraining order, blocking the HOA from issuing any more citations to me or the other plaintiffs until the case was resolved. That's when Patricia really lost it. She sent an email to all residents claiming I was a troublemaker trying to destroy the community. She said the lawsuit was frivolous and that if I won, everyone's HOA fees would skyrocket to cover the damages. The Facebook group lit up with responses. People were furious at Patricia, not me. More residents joined the lawsuit. By the end of April, we had 75 plaintiffs. Meanwhile, the Attorney General's office opened an official investigation. 2 investigators showed up at the complex in early May and started interviewing residents and demanding financial records from the HOA. Patricia refused to cooperate and hired a criminal defense attorney. That's when I knew we had her. Walker and I had become close friends through all of this. He was at my place almost every night, helping me organize evidence and strategize. He'd also started refusing to tow cars for bogus violations, which got him fired from the Desert Vista contract. But he didn't care. I'd rather sleep at night than work for crooks, he said. His boss at Mike's Towing wasn't happy, but Walker had enough other contracts to stay afloat. Plus, he was getting calls from residents at other complexes dealing with similar HOA issues. He was becoming the go-to guy for people fighting back. In mid-May, the Attorney General's office issued a formal subpoena for all HOA financial records. Patricia tried to delay, but the judge ordered immediate compliance. When the records were finally produced, they were a mess. Huge gaps, missing receipts, unexplained transfers. It was clear Patricia had been cooking the books. On May 28th, the Arizona Attorney General's office filed criminal charges against Patricia Kensington, Gerald Fletcher, and Susan Morris for fraud, embezzlement, and theft. The amounts were staggering. Over $600,000 had been misappropriated from HOA funds over 2 years. The news broke on local TV. I watched the broadcast with Walker at my place, both of us holding beers and grinning like idiots. "You did it," Walker said. "You actually took down a corrupt HOA." "We did it. I couldn't have done this without you." The next day, police arrested Patricia at her home. The footage was on every local news station. Patricia being walked out in handcuffs, screaming about how this was a witch hunt and she'd done nothing wrong. Gerald and Susan were arrested later that day. The HOA immediately dissolved the board and appointed an interim management company. One of their first acts was to rescind all parking space sales and return the spaces to their original owners. The people who'd bought spaces were refunded their money from the HOA's reserve fund. I got my parking spaces back on June 3rd. I stood there looking at my unit number freshly painted on the asphalt, feeling a mix of relief and vindication. Walker came by to celebrate, bringing pizza and beer. "How's it feel?" he asked. "Surreal. I still can't believe we won." "You didn't just win, you sent 3 criminals to jail." The criminal case moved forward through the summer. Patricia, Gerald, and Susan all tried to plea bargain, but the Attorney General's office wasn't interested. They wanted to make an example of them. The trial started in September. I testified, along with dozens of other residents. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, emails, witness testimony, all of it pointing to a deliberate scheme to defraud homeowners. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Patricia was found guilty on all counts. Gerald and Susan were convicted of lesser charges, but still faced prison time. At sentencing in October, Patricia got 8 years in state prison. Gerald got 3 years. Susan got 2 years and probation. The civil lawsuit settled shortly after. The HOA's insurance company paid out $1.2 million to the plaintiffs. After legal fees, each of us got about $12,000. It wasn't life-changing money, but it felt like justice. More importantly, the HOA reformed completely. A new board was elected, this time with actual oversight and transparency. They implemented new rules requiring financial audits, term limits for board members, and mandatory disclosure of any conflicts of interest. The complex finally got its clubhouse renovation, paid for by the insurance settlement and remaining reserve funds. Walker and I stayed close friends. He ended up starting his own towing company focused on ethical practices and helping residents fight abusive HOAs. I became an advocate for HOA reform in Arizona, testifying before the state legislature on bills to increase oversight and protect homeowners. Looking back, the whole thing started with a parking space dispute and ended with criminal convictions and sweeping reforms. It was exhausting, stressful, and expensive in ways I hadn't anticipated. But it was worth it. One evening in November, Walker and I were sitting on my patio, watching the sunset over the Phoenix skyline. My car was parked in one of my 2 reserved spaces, exactly where it belonged. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd just let it go?" Walker asked. "All the time. Patricia would still be stealing from people. The HOA would still be out of control. I'd probably be broke from fines and living somewhere else. Instead, you became the guy who took down one of the most corrupt HOAs in Arizona history." I laughed. "I didn't do it alone. You risked your job to help me. Rebecca took the case on contingency. Margaret and the other residents stood up. It was a team effort." "True, but you started it. You refused to back down." He was right. When that guy in the BMW told me my parking spaces were sold, I could have just accepted it and moved on. But something in me refused to let them get away with it. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was principle, probably both. The whole experience taught me a lot about power and corruption. HOAs are supposed to serve homeowners, but when unchecked, they become little fiefdoms run by petty tyrants. Patricia Kensington thought she could do whatever she wanted because nobody would stop her. She'd gotten away with it before. But this time, people fought back. We used the law, organized our community, and held her accountable. It wasn't easy or fast, but it worked. The Facebook group I created, Desert Vista HOA Victims, evolved into a broader advocacy group called Arizona HOA Accountability. We had over 2,000 members across the state, all sharing stories and strategies for dealing with abusive HOAs. We'd helped dozens of communities address similar issues, sometimes just by providing information and support, other times by connecting them with lawyers and investigators. Walker's new towing company, Fair Tow Phoenix, became the most requested towing service for HOAs in the valley. His reputation for honesty and fairness made him the anti-Patricia. HOAs knew that if they hired Walker, he'd enforce the rules fairly and call them out if they tried anything shady. Rebecca Torres made partner at her law firm partly based on the success of our case. She now headed their HOA litigation department and had won several other major cases against corrupt boards. She still called me occasionally for advice or to connect her with residents in other communities. As for me, life returned to something resembling normal. I still worked at the engineering firm, still lived in my condo at Desert Vista, but I'd changed. I was more aware, more engaged, more willing to fight for what was right. The new HOA board was night and day compared to Patricia's regime. They held regular meetings with actual public participation. They published detailed financial reports every quarter. They responded to resident concerns with respect and transparency. It was what an HOA was supposed to be. My relationship with my neighbors improved dramatically too. Before the parking space fiasco, I barely knew anyone in the complex. We'd nod politely in passing, maybe exchange pleasantries about the weather, but that was it. Fighting the HOA together created real community. We looked out for each other now. Margaret, the retired teacher who'd first uncovered the financial irregularities, became the new board president. She ran unopposed and won unanimously. Her first act was to establish a homeowner bill of rights, guaranteeing due process before any fines or violations could be issued. Her second act was to reduce HOA fees by 15% after discovering we'd been overpaying for years. One Saturday in December, the complex held a holiday party at the newly renovated clubhouse. The place looked amazing. New floors, updated kitchen, fresh paint, comfortable furniture. It was everything Patricia had promised but never delivered. I was standing by the punch bowl when a woman approached me. She was in her 30s, professional looking, with kind eyes. "You're William Ingram, right?" "That's me." "I'm Jennifer. I just moved into Unit 223. I wanted to thank you. I almost didn't buy here because of all the bad reviews online about the old HOA. But when I read about what you did, how you fixed things, I knew this was the right community. So thank you." I felt a swell of pride. Just doing what needed to be done. Welcome to Desert Vista. We chatted for a while, and I introduced her to other residents. Watching her integrate into the community, I realized that what we'd accomplished had lasting impact. Future residents would benefit from the reforms we'd fought for. Kids would grow up in a community run fairly, where people stood up against injustice. Walker showed up late, straight from a towing job, still in his work coveralls. He grabbed a plate of food and found me in the crowd. "Sorry I'm late. Had to tow a car from a Walmart parking lot. Actual abandoned vehicle this time, not HOA nonsense." "How's business?" "Great. I'm actually thinking about expanding, maybe hiring another driver. There's so much demand for ethical towing services." "That's amazing." "Yeah, and it's all because you dragged me into your HOA war." He grinned. "Best thing that ever happened to my career." We stood there watching the party, residents laughing and talking, kids running around the new clubhouse. It felt good. It felt like victory. But the fight wasn't entirely over. In early January, Patricia's lawyers filed an appeal of her criminal conviction, arguing that the trial judge had made errors in admitting certain evidence. The Attorney General's office wasn't worried. They said the evidence was overwhelming, and the appeal had little chance of success. Still, it was a reminder that people like Patricia don't go down quietly. Even from prison, she was still trying to worm her way out of consequences. The appeal hearing was scheduled for March. Rebecca advised me that I didn't need to attend, but I wanted to be there. So did Walker and Margaret and about 20 other residents. We filled the courtroom, a silent reminder to the judges that real people had been hurt by Patricia's crimes. Patricia appeared via video from the state prison where she was serving her sentence. She looked haggard, older, defeated. Her lawyer made his arguments about improper evidence and procedural errors. The prosecutors countered with citations and case law. The judges asked pointed questions. The hearing lasted 2 hours. At the end, the chief judge announced they'd issue a written decision within 60 days. We filed out of the courthouse uncertain but hopeful. Walker and I grabbed lunch afterward at a diner near the courthouse. "How do you think it went?" he asked. "I think the judges saw through her lawyer's arguments, but you never know with appeals. If they overturn it, we start again. We have all the evidence. We'll make sure she doesn't get away with it." I appreciated his determination, but I was tired. Fighting Patricia and the HOA had consumed nearly a year of my life. I wanted it to be over. The decision came down in early May, almost exactly 2 years after the whole ordeal started. The appeals court upheld Patricia's conviction on all counts. Her sentence stood. It was finally, truly over. I called Walker as soon as I heard. We won. Again. I never doubted it. Want to celebrate? Absolutely. We met at a bar in Scottsdale and raised glasses to justice, persistence, and the power of ordinary people to hold the powerful accountable. Rebecca joined us, along with Margaret and several other residents who'd been part of the lawsuit. As the night wore on and the drinks flowed, people shared stories about the fight. The late nights researching laws, the stress of the trial, the fear of retaliation, but also the moments of triumph. When the judge granted our restraining order, when the criminal charges were filed, when the jury announced the guilty verdict, Margaret raised her glass. To William, who refused to accept injustice and inspired all of us to fight back. Everyone cheered, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment and pride. I couldn't have done any of this without all of you. This was a community effort. But you started it, Margaret insisted. You had the courage to stand up first. She was right, though I'd never thought of it as courage. It was more like stubbornness and anger. But maybe that's what courage is sometimes. Refusing to accept the unacceptable, even when it's hard and scary and expensive. The conversation turned to the future. Arizona legislators were considering new laws to increase HOA oversight, partly inspired by our case. There was talk of mandatory financial audits, stricter board member requirements, and easier pathways for homeowners to recall corrupt boards. I'd been invited to testify before the state legislature in support of these reforms. It was scheduled for June, just a few weeks away. I was nervous about public speaking, but I knew I had to do it. If my story could help prevent other homeowners from going through what we went through, it was worth the anxiety. The legislative hearing was in the Arizona State Capitol building, an impressive structure with copper dome and marble columns. I arrived early, wearing my best suit, clutching printed copies of my testimony. Walker came with me for moral support. You've got this. Just tell your story. The committee room was formal and intimidating. Legislators sat at a raised bench, looking down at the witness table. A handful of spectators filled the gallery, including some HOA industry lobbyists who were there to oppose the reforms. When my turn came, I sat at the witness table and adjusted the microphone. My hands were shaking. I looked up at the committee members, took a deep breath, and began. I told them everything, how my parking spaces were sold without notice, how the HOA retaliated with bogus fines, how we discovered the embezzlement and fraud, how 3 board members were now in prison, how the system had failed to protect homeowners until we fought back. I talked about the stress, the financial burden, the toll it took on residents. I talked about elderly homeowners on fixed incomes who were crushed by illegal fines, about single parents who couldn't afford legal representation, about how HOAs had become vehicles for corruption with no meaningful oversight. When I finished, the committee chair thanked me and asked questions. How could the legislature balance HOA autonomy with homeowner protection? What specific reforms would help? How could they prevent retaliation against whistleblowers? I answered as best I could, drawing on my experience and the expertise of advocates I'd worked with. I emphasized transparency, accountability, and accessible dispute resolution mechanisms. The HOA industry lobbyists testified next, arguing that increased regulation would burden well-functioning HOAs and drive up costs. They claimed cases like mine were rare exceptions and that most HOAs operated ethically. I wanted to laugh or scream, but I sat quietly and let them speak. The legislators asked tough questions. They'd done their homework. They cited other cases of HOA abuse in Arizona and across the country. The lobbyists got defensive, insisting those were isolated incidents. In the end, the committee voted to advance the reform bill to the full legislature. It wasn't a guarantee it would pass, but it was progress. Outside the Capitol, Walker clapped me on the shoulder. You killed it in there. Those legislators were listening. I hope so. Even if the bill doesn't pass this year, at least we're starting the conversation. It'll pass. People are tired of corrupt HOAs. You proved they can be held accountable. That matters. We grabbed dinner at a Mexican restaurant downtown, celebrating another small victory in a long war. I was starting to realize that fighting corruption wasn't a one-time thing. It was ongoing. Systems didn't fix themselves. They required constant vigilance and people willing to stand up. The reform bill passed the Arizona legislature in August and was signed into law by the governor in September. It included mandatory annual financial audits for HOAs over a certain size, term limits for board members, strict conflict of interest rules, protection for whistleblowers, and an expedited dispute resolution process through the state. It wasn't perfect, but it was a huge step forward, and it was directly inspired by our case. News articles about the bill signing mentioned Desert Vista and Patricia Kensington's conviction. Our fight had created real systemic change. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. I stayed active in HOA advocacy, helping other communities when asked, but I wasn't leading the charge anymore. I'd done my part. Now, it was time to let others carry the torch. Walker's towing business continued to grow. He hired 3 more drivers and expanded into commercial towing. He was making good money and enjoying work for the first time in years. We still got together regularly, usually to watch football or grab dinner. Our friendship, forged in the fires of fighting corruption, had become one of the best things to come out of the whole experience. Margaret served 2 successful terms as HOA board president before stepping down to enjoy her retirement. Under her leadership, Desert Vista became a model for how HOAs should operate. Other complexes sent representatives to study our governance structure and bylaws. Rebecca Torres continued to win major cases against abusive HOAs. She became one of the most sought-after HOA attorneys in Arizona, and she used her platform to advocate for homeowner rights. We stayed in touch, occasionally meeting for coffee to discuss ongoing cases and legislative developments. As for Patricia Kensington, she remained in prison, serving her 8-year sentence. I didn't think about her much anymore. She was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. But she was no longer part of my life. Looking back now, more than 3 years after that BMW driver told me my parking spaces were sold, I can see how much everything changed. I changed. I went from someone who kept his head down and avoided conflict to someone willing to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. The community changed too. Desert Vista went from a place run by tyrants to a genuine community where people looked out for each other and held leaders accountable. And hopefully, Arizona changed a little bit too. The reforms we fought for were now law, protecting homeowners across the state. Future Patricia Kensingtons would find it much harder to abuse their power. One evening in late November, I was sitting on my patio reading a book in the fading light. My car was parked in one of my 2 reserved spaces, right where it belonged. The complex was quiet, peaceful. The clubhouse lights were on, and I could hear laughter from a resident gathering inside. My phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but it had a Phoenix area code, so I answered. "Is this William Ingram?" a woman's voice asked. "Speaking. My name is Diane. I live at Sunset Gardens Condominiums in Tempe. Our HOA is doing something similar to what happened at your complex. They're trying to charge us for parking spaces that were included with our units. I found your story online and wondered if you could help." I smiled. "Tell me what's happening." She explained the situation, and it was eerily familiar. An aggressive board, questionable fees, threats of fines and liens, the same playbook Patricia had used. "First thing you need to do is request all financial records under Arizona's disclosure laws," I said. "Then gather other affected residents. There's strength in numbers, and document everything, every email, every violation notice, every conversation." We talked for over an hour. I gave her Rebecca Torres's contact information and connected her with the Arizona HOA Accountability Group. By the time we hung up, she sounded hopeful instead of defeated. Walker called a few minutes later. "Did you just take on another HOA fight?" "How did you know?" "Because I know you. You can't help yourself." He was right. I couldn't just ignore people going through what I went through. If my experience could help them, I had to try. "Want to drive over to Tempe this weekend and check out their complex?" Walker asked. "You read my mind." That Saturday, Walker and I met with Diane and about 15 other residents from Sunset Gardens. We walked them through everything we'd learned: how to research HOA law, how to organize residents, how to document violations and build a case, how to find a good lawyer, how to protect themselves from retaliation. They were scared, but determined. I recognized that look. It was the same look I'd had 2 years ago, standing in the parking lot arguing with the BMW guy. "You can win this," I told them. "It won't be easy and it won't be quick, but if you stick together and don't give up, you can hold them accountable." Diane shook my hand. "Thank you." I was feeling so alone in this. Knowing someone else went through it and came out the other side gives me hope. You're not alone. None of us are. That's the whole point. On the drive back to Phoenix, Walker was quiet. Finally, he said, "You know you're never going to stop doing this, right? Fighting HOAs is basically your second job now." "I guess so. Is that a bad thing?" "Hell no, it's a great thing. You found your purpose. I hadn't thought about it that way, but he was right. For years I'd gone through life on autopilot. Work, home, repeat. The HOA fight woke me up. It showed me that one person, or a group of determined people, could make a real difference. It was addicting in the best way. Over the next year, I helped 3 more communities deal with HOA corruption. 2 cases settled quickly once the boards realized residents were organized and informed. The third went to litigation, and the board members were eventually removed and fined. Each victory felt good, but more importantly, each fight empowered residents who'd felt powerless. That was the real win. Teaching people they didn't have to accept abuse from petty tyrants with tiny amounts of authority. The Arizona HOA Accountability Group grew to over 5,000 members. We held quarterly meetings, sharing information and strategies. We maintained a database of HOA attorneys, investigators, and resources. We lobbied for additional reforms at the state legislature. I became a regular fixture at legislative hearings, testifying in support of homeowner protections. I'd overcome my fear of public speaking through sheer repetition. Now it felt natural. Walker and I started a podcast called HOA Horror Stories, where we interviewed homeowners dealing with abusive associations. It became surprisingly popular, with thousands of downloads per episode. We used it to raise awareness and connect people with resources. Life had become fuller, richer, more meaningful, all because I refused to accept losing my parking spaces. One day, about 4 years after everything started, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Patricia Kensington. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was handwritten, shaky script on lined paper. She wrote that she'd been doing a lot of thinking in prison and realized how much harm she'd caused. She claimed to be remorseful and asked for my forgiveness. I read it twice, trying to determine if it was genuine or manipulative. Probably both. People like Patricia didn't change overnight, if they changed at all. But maybe prison had given her perspective. Or maybe she just wanted to feel better about herself. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't owe her forgiveness, and I wasn't interested in engaging with her. She made her choices and faced the consequences. That was enough. I did show the letter to Walker, who laughed. She's probably angling for early release and wants character references. Don't fall for it. I won't, but part of me wonders if she really does regret it. Maybe. Doesn't matter, though. She still did it. She still hurt a lot of people. Sorry doesn't fix that. He was right. Accountability wasn't about feelings or apologies. It was about consequences and making sure the harm didn't continue. Patricia would serve her full sentence. Gerald and Susan were already out on parole, having served their shorter terms. I occasionally wondered what they were doing, if they'd learned anything. But mostly, I didn't think about them at all. My focus was on the future, on helping communities avoid the same fate, on building systems that prevented corruption rather than just punishing it after the fact. The reforms we'd fought for were working. HOAs across Arizona were conducting proper audits and being more transparent. The state had prosecuted several other cases of HOA fraud, sending a message that this behavior wouldn't be tolerated. It wasn't a complete solution. Corruption always finds a way. But it was progress, real and measurable. On the 5-year anniversary of the parking space incident, the Desert Vista HOA held a special ceremony. They unveiled a plaque in the clubhouse commemorating the residents who fought for reform. My name was on it, along with Margaret's and several others. I stood there looking at it, feeling a mix of emotions, pride, certainly, but also sadness for what we'd all gone through, relief that it was over, hope for the future. The current board president, a software engineer named Tom, gave a speech about the importance of vigilance and community. What happened here 5 years ago should never happen again, he said. But the only way to ensure that is for all of us to stay engaged, ask questions, and hold our leaders accountable. William and Margaret and everyone else on this plaque showed us how. Let's honor them by continuing their work. People applauded. I shook hands and accepted congratulations. Walker was there, grinning like always. Rebecca came too, taking time away from her busy practice to celebrate. After the ceremony, a young couple approached me. "We just bought a unit here last month," the woman said, "and we were nervous about HOAs after hearing horror stories. But when we read about this community's history and reforms, we knew it was the right place. Thank you for making this possible. That meant more to me than any plaque. Knowing that future residents would benefit from our fight made it all worthwhile. As the sun set over Phoenix that evening, I stood in one of my 2 reserved parking spaces and thought about the journey. From an angry homeowner fighting over parking to an advocate helping communities across the state. From someone who avoided conflict to someone who ran toward it when justice demanded. It started with something small and absurd, a parking space. But it became something bigger, a fight against corruption and abuse of power, a demonstration that ordinary people can hold the powerful accountable, a reminder that giving up is never the only option. Walker pulled up in his tow truck, now with Fair Tow Phoenix emblazoned on the side in bright letters. He rolled down the window. Ready to grab dinner? Absolutely. Where to? There's a new barbecue place in Scottsdale, supposed to be amazing. We drove off into the desert evening, 2 friends bound by an unlikely alliance against HOA tyranny. The parking spaces I'd fought so hard for sat empty behind me, waiting for my return. Exactly as they should be. The whole experience taught me that justice isn't something that just happens. It's something people fight for, day after day, decision after decision. Sometimes it's big dramatic courtroom victories, sometimes it's small acts of resistance. But it always requires ordinary people refusing to accept injustice. I was just a guy who wanted his parking spaces back. But in fighting for them, I discovered something more important. Community, purpose, the knowledge that standing up matters even when it's hard. Patricia Kensington and people like her count on people staying quiet, staying scared, staying isolated. They count on us accepting abuse because fighting back seems too difficult or expensive or risky. But we didn't stay quiet. We organized, documented, fought back, and won. We sent criminals to prison, reformed an entire system, and helped countless other communities do the same. And it all started because a tow truck driver decided to help instead of just following orders. Because a lawyer took a case on contingency. Because a retired teacher uncovered financial records. Because dozens of residents decided to stand together instead of suffering alone. That's the real story here. Not one person's heroism, but a community's collective action. We all played our part. We all mattered. As I sat in that barbecue restaurant with Walker, eating brisket and talking about our latest HOA case, I felt grateful. Not for the fight itself, which was hell, but for what came from it. Friendship, purpose, the knowledge that I could make a difference. My parking spaces were just parking spaces. But what they represented was dignity, fairness, the right to not be cheated by the people entrusted with authority. Fighting for them meant fighting for something bigger than myself. And that fight continues. There will always be another Patricia Kensington, another corrupt board, another community that needs help. But there will also always be people willing to stand up, organize, and fight back. I'm one of those people now, so is Walker. So are thousands of members of Arizona HOA Accountability. We're ordinary people who decided that enough was enough. We proved that HOAs can be held accountable, that corruption can be exposed and punished, that homeowners aren't powerless even when it feels that way. My reserved parking spaces are right where they belong, with my unit number painted clearly on the asphalt. Every time I park there, I remember what it took to keep them. The stress, the fear, the anger, the determination. But I also remember the victory, the moment the jury announced guilty verdicts, the day the appeals court upheld the convictions, the passage of reform legislation, the plaque on the clubhouse wall. Most of all, I remember that I didn't do it alone. An army of residents, a dedicated lawyer, a tow truck driver with a conscience, and so many others made it possible. That's the lesson here. Corruption thrives in isolation, but withers under collective action. Patricia thought she could do whatever she wanted because nobody would stop her. She was wrong. We stopped her. We'll stop the next one too. And the one after that. Because that's what communities do when they decide they've had enough. My name is William Ingram, and I live at Desert Vista Condominiums in Phoenix, Arizona. 5 years ago, my HOA sold my parking spaces to strangers. Today, those spaces are mine again, 3 board members are in prison, and Arizona has stronger homeowner protections. It was the fight of my life. But looking back, I wouldn't change a thing.